You know, I've noticed something peculiar over the years. People come up to me and say they understand quantum mechanics, or they understand relativity. And when I ask them to explain it, they repeat the words back to me. Beautiful words, elegant phrases. But it's like they're reciting poetry in a language they don't speak. That's not understanding. That's something else entirely. Let me tell you what I mean, and maybe you'll recognize yourself in this. I certainly recognized myself when I was younger. When I was a student at MIT, I thought I was pretty smart. I could solve problems, pass exams, manipulate equations. I knew how to get the right answer. But there was a professor there, his name doesn't matter, who asked me something after class one day. He said, explain to me why, when you spin an electron, it takes 2 full rotations to come back to its original state, not 1. I started talking about spinors and group theory and mathematical properties. I used all the right words. He just looked at me and said, but do you know why? I didn't. I had no idea. I knew the mathematics, but I didn't understand the thing itself. And that embarrassed me more than any wrong answer ever could. That moment stuck with me, because I realized I'd been fooling myself. I'd been collecting facts and formulas like stamps in an album, but I hadn't been thinking about what they meant. I hadn't been asking the real questions. So I started doing something different. When I encountered something new, let's say, a principle in physics or mathematics, I would sit down and try to work it out from scratch, not by looking it up, not by memorizing what someone else said. I would ask, if I knew nothing except the most basic facts, could I figure this out? Sometimes I'd spend days on a single idea. I'd invent my own notation. I'd draw pictures. I'd make up little stories about particles or waves or whatever I was studying. Most importantly, I'd test myself. Could I explain this to someone who'd never heard of it before? If I couldn't, I didn't understand it. Simple as that. Let me give you an example. When I was working at Los Alamos during the war, we were doing calculations about the bomb. Serious work, life and death, really. And there were all these brilliant people there, Einstein, Bohr, Oppenheimer. I was just a kid. One day, someone presented a calculation about neutron diffusion. Very complicated, lots of integral equations. Everyone nodded. It looked impressive, but I had this nagging feeling that something was off. I couldn't shake it. So that night I went back to my desk and I thought, forget the fancy mathematics for a moment. What's actually happening here? We have neutrons. They're bouncing around. Some get absorbed. Some cause fissions. It's like a bunch of drunk people wandering through a city, randomly bumping into buildings. I drew a picture. I imagined following a single neutron on its journey. Where does it go? What happens to it? I thought about it in the simplest possible terms, like I was explaining it to a child. And you know what? I found an error, a small one, but it mattered. The fancy mathematics had hidden an incorrect assumption. Everyone had been so busy following the equations that nobody had stopped to ask, does this make physical sense? That taught me something crucial. Understanding isn't about sophistication. It's not about using the right jargon or impressing people with complex formulas. It's about being able to strip away all the decoration and see the naked truth underneath. Here's what I learned to do, and what I still do to this day. First, when someone tells me they understand something, I ask them, can you give me an example? Not the textbook example, a new one you just made up. Because if you really understand a principle, you can apply it to situations you've never seen before. If you can only repeat the examples you were taught, you've memorized, not understood. Second, I try to find the simplest possible way to think about something. I had a friend once who said, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't really understand it. Now, I don't know if that's exactly true. Some things are genuinely complicated, but the spirit is right. Simplicity is a sign of understanding. Complexity is often a sign of confusion. I used to do this exercise. I'd take something from my field, let's say, the principle of least action, and I'd pretend I was explaining it to my little sister when she was young. No equations, no fancy terms. Just what's happening. Why does nature work this way? And here's the interesting part. When I did this, I almost always discovered something I hadn't noticed before. Some little detail, some connection. The act of simplifying forced me to actually think about what was going on, rather than just pushing symbols around on paper. Third, and this is important, I learned to be honest about what I didn't know. This is harder than it sounds. We all want to appear smart. We all want to have answers. But the truth is, there's so much we don't know, so much I don't know. When I was teaching at Caltech, students would ask me questions, and sometimes I'd say, I don't know, let's figure it out together. And we would, right there in class. I'd work through it out loud, making mistakes, backtracking, trying different approaches. Some of my colleagues thought this was undignified. How can a professor admit he doesn't know something? But the students learn more from watching me struggle with a problem than they ever learned from watching me present a polished solution. because they saw how thinking actually works. It's messy. It's uncertain. It involves a lot of wrong turns and dead ends. Now, you might be wondering, isn't this inefficient? Shouldn't we just learn from experts, accept what they tell us, and build on top of that? Well, yes and no. Of course we stand on the shoulders of giants. Of course we don't need to rederive all of physics from first principles every time we want to solve a problem. That would be absurd. But there's a difference between accepting something provisionally and accepting it blindly. When I learn something from a book or a paper, I accept it as probably true. These people know more than me. They've done the work, but I hold it lightly. I keep asking, does this make sense? Does it fit with everything else I know? Could there be another explanation? I remember reading about the Wheeler-Feynman absorber theory. Well, I worked on it, actually, with John Wheeler. We had this idea about radiation and time symmetry. Very elegant mathematically, but there was something about it that bothered me. I couldn't put my finger on it, so I kept poking at it. I'd think about it while I was walking, while I was eating. I'd imagine different scenarios, different experiments. And eventually, I realized the theory made predictions that didn't quite match reality in certain extreme cases. The mathematics was beautiful, but nature didn't care about our mathematics. That's the thing. Nature is what it is. Our job isn't to make up pretty theories and force nature to fit them. Our job is to look at nature carefully, honestly, and try to understand what it's telling us. Let me tell you what this looks like in practice, because I think that's what you really want to know. When I encounter something new now, a paper, an idea, a problem, I go through a process. It's not formal. I didn't write it down as a method. But if I had to describe it, here's what I do. I start by asking, what does this really say? I try to state the idea in the simplest possible terms, in my own words, not the author's words, mine. If I can't do that, I don't understand it yet. Then I ask, what would happen if this were true? What are the consequences? I try to work out predictions, simple cases, examples. I play with the idea like a toy. I turn it over in my mind, look at it from different angles. Next, and this is crucial, I ask, what would convince me this is wrong? What evidence would I need to see to reject this idea? Because if I can't imagine anything that would prove it wrong, then I'm not really thinking about it critically. I'm just believing it. Finally, I try to connect it to other things I know. Does it fit? Does it contradict something else I believe to be true? If there's a contradiction, maybe I'm misunderstanding something. Or maybe one of my beliefs is wrong. Either way, I need to figure out which. This process, it takes time. It's not fast. But here's what I've discovered. When I do this, I actually remember things. They stick, because I haven't just memorized them, I've understood them. They become part of how I think about the world. You know what's funny? People sometimes call this the Feynman Technique, like I invented something. I didn't invent anything. This is just thinking, real thinking. The kind of thinking that children do naturally before we train it out of them. Watch a child learn about the world. They don't memorize. They experiment. They ask why over and over. They're not satisfied with answers that don't make sense. They want to understand. Somewhere along the way, we lose that. We learn that there are right answers and wrong answers, and the goal is to know the right answers. We learn that understanding is measured by grades and test scores. We learn to be afraid of saying, I don't know. But real understanding, the kind that matters, the kind that lets you do something new, doesn't come from memorizing right answers. It comes from wrestling with questions, from being confused and sitting with that confusion until something clicks, from trying, failing, and trying again differently. I spent my whole career around people who could quote theorems and recite proofs. Very smart people. But the ones who actually contributed something new, the ones who saw things nobody else saw, were the ones who weren't satisfied with just knowing. They wanted to understand, really understand, down to the bones. Here's something I want you to think about. We live in a world now where information is everywhere. You can look up anything in seconds. You can watch lectures from the best teachers, read papers from the leading experts, access more knowledge than any library in history. And yet, I'm not sure we understand things better than we used to. Maybe it's because we've confused having access to information with understanding that information. They're not the same thing, not even close. I can look up how a radio works. I can read the explanation. I can nod along. But unless I've actually thought about it, really thought about it, worked through it in my own mind, I don't understand it. I just know what someone said about it. There's a world of difference between those two things. So here's what I'd suggest. If you want to really understand something, anything, not just physics, pick something you think you understand, something from your work, or your field, or just something you're curious about. Now try to explain it out loud, as if you're teaching someone who knows nothing about it. Use simple language, no jargon, no fancy terms, just clear, plain words. When you get stuck, and you will get stuck, that's where you don't actually understand. That's the gap. Don't ignore it. Don't paper over it with vague language. Sit with it. Think about it. Go back to basics. Work through it until you can explain it clearly. This is uncomfortable. It's much easier to stay in the comfortable illusion that we understand things because we can recognize the words. But if you can push through that discomfort, something wonderful happens. You start to see connections you never saw before. You start to ask questions that never occurred to you. You start to think for yourself rather than just repeating what others have thought. And that's when understanding becomes something more than just knowing facts. It becomes a way of seeing the world. I'm an old man now. I've spent my whole life thinking about how nature works. And the more I understand, the more I realize how much I don't understand. That might sound pessimistic, but it's not. It's actually thrilling. Because every real understanding opens up new questions. Every answer leads to deeper mysteries. That's what makes this worth doing. People sometimes ask me, what's the secret to being a good physicist or a good thinker? I don't think there is a secret, really. It's just this. Be honest about what you don't know. Be patient with confusion. Be willing to start from the beginning, no matter how simple that beginning seems. And never, ever fool yourself into thinking you understand something when all you've really done is memorize someone else's understanding. The world is stranger and more beautiful than any story we tell about it. Our job, if we're curious, if we care about truth, is to look at the world as it actually is, not as we wish it were or as we've been told it is. That's all understanding really is. Seeing clearly, thinking honestly, being willing to be wrong. And you know what? That's enough. That's more than enough. It's everything.